اسیر ہو کے چلی ہوں. Hello, check. Hello. سلوات. جی ہاں. ہلو. ہلو. یہ وہ بندہ ہے کیا؟ سلوات.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
اسیر ہو کے چلی ہوں، سلام لو بابا. اسیر ہو کے چلی ہوں، سلام لو بابا. یہ ابتدا ہے مصیبت کی، انتہا ہی نہیں. گزر گئی ہے قیامت مگر گلا بھی نہیں. پھوپھی کے سر پا کفن کے لیے ردا بھی نہیں. اور آج ہوش میں بیمار کربلا بھی نہیں. اسیر ہو کے چلی ہوں، سلام لو بابا. ہمارا کرب و بلا میں خیام ہو نہ سکا، تمہارے دفن کا بھی انتظام ہو نہ سکا. پڑے ہو خاک پا کچھ اہتمام ہو نہ سکا. یہ ضعف ہے کہ ادا بھی سلام ہو نہ سکا. اسیر ہو کے چلی ہوں، ہے سر پہ خاک بھی غم بھی ہے اور بکا بھی ہے.
کم سنی بھی مصیبت بھی اور جفا بھی ہے، پھوپھی کے ساتھ رسن میں میرا گلا بھی ہے، ان آفتوں سے گزرنے کا حوصلہ بھی ہے، سنا ہے شام کا دربار جب بھرا ہوگا، یزید کا سر دربار سامنا ہوگا، میرا تو بھائی بھی زنجیر میں بندھا ہوگا، پھوپھی جو پوچھے گی دربار میں تو کیا ہوگا، اسیر ہو کے چلی ہوں سلام لو بابا، ہے اب بھی پیش نظر واقعات کرب و بلا، وہی ہے شمر کا خنجر، وہی ہے شے کا گلا، وہی ہے شام کا بازار اور وہی کوفہ، عروج ابھی سکینہ کی آ رہی ہے صدا، اسیر ہو کے چلی ہوں سلام لو بابا،
فاتحہ۔ اللہم صلی اللہ علیہ وسلم۔ بسم اللہ الحمدللہ۔ جس پنجتن کسی سے تولا نہ چاہیے، غیر از خدا کسی کا برو، غیر از خدا کسی کا بھروسہ نہ چاہیے، ایک در پر بیٹھ کر ہے توکل کریم پر اللہ کے فقیر کو، پھر اللہ کے فقیر کو پھیرا سغران شاہدین کو لکھا خط بھیجئے، گر چاہتے نہیں ہمیں اچھا نہ چاہیے، دو بیٹیاں تو پاس ہوں،
ایک جاں بلب بعید میں سچ کہوں یہ آپ کو میں سچ کہوں یہ آپ کو کہتی تھی فضا شام میں بازاریوں ہٹو آلے رسول پر ستم ایسا نہ چاہیے یہ کون بیویاں ہے تمہیں کچھ خبر نہیں زہرا کی بیٹیوں کا زہرا کی بیٹیوں کا تماشا نہ چاہیے جز پنجتن کسی عزیز و حادثین و فلک دکھاتا ہے حرم کا قافلہ پیش یزید جاتا ہے گلے بندے ہیں بدن سب کا تھر تھراتا ہے نہ سانس لیتے قید نہ سانس لیتے قید نہ بولا جات جو گرتے ہیں تو ستمگار نیزے مارتے ہیں وہ رو کے حیدر کرار وہ رو کے حیدر کرار کو پکار کہو اسیروں کا سب حال یہ مجال ہے کیا پہاد بندنے کا مضمون ہے دست بستہ کھڑا ہوا ہے بیڑیوں سے بس کے غلغلہ پیدا بطول خلد میں حیدر کو دے رہی ہے صدا بلند کرتی ہے فریاد یا علی زینب چلو یزید کے دربار چلو یزید کے دربار چلو یزید کے دربار میں چلے نہیں جفا ہے کہ 12 گلے اور ایک رسن اور اس رسن پا ہے توقے گرا کر رنج و محال کہیں سنا ہے کہ 2 طوق اور ایک گردان اور ایک پاؤں میں بھاری 2 حلقے آہن جو پاس آکے لائن نیزوں سے ڈراتے ہیں خدا کے واسطے بچے خدا کے واسطے بچے خدا کے واسطے بچوں نے دلا جفائے کے کہنے میں کانپتی ہے زبان غرض کے داخلے مجلس ہوئے باہو بکا مگر کب آئے حضور یزید بے ایمان کے چوبے بیتی اور شاہ کے لبو دندہ چھڑی تو ایک تھی پر ظلم دو نمایاں تھے بزیر چوک بھی لپتے بزیر چوک بھی لپتے گا ہاتھن یہ ظلم دے کے زینب نے کر لی آنکھیں بند پکارا شمر کیے دربار کیا نہ آیا پسند لو آنکھیں کھولو نہیں ظلم ہوئے گا دہچان فلک کو دیکھ کے رونے لگی وہ غیرت مند کہا یزید نے کیا آسمان کو دیکھا وہ رو کے بولے گے خالق کی شان کو کہا یزید نے تب شمر سے بتائش تمام یہ کون ہے کہ جو بڑھ بڑھ کے کر رہی ہے کلام وہ بولی پوچھ مجھے سے یہ جانے کیا میرا نام میں رونے والی ہوں کنبے کی زینب ناکام علی کی آئی ندا میں پیری پیاری دختر ہے سر حسین پکارا سر حسین پکارا ہماری یزید جائزہ پھر قیدیوں کا لینے لگا نظر پڑی اسے ایک شاہزادی محلقہ الٹ کے ڈالا ہے منہ پر پھٹا ہوا کرتا اور اس پر ہاتھوں سے پردہ کیا ہے چہرے کا ہے سن میں قرآن بزرگوں کا پر قرینہ ہے کہا یہ کون ہے بولا کہا یہ کون ہے بولا کہا یہ کون ہے بولا عمر سکینہ یزید لے سکینہ پر رویا اور یہ کہا سکینہ تجھ کو بہت چاہتا تھا بات تیرا وہ بولی چاہنا کیسا پدر تھے مجھے پافدا زبان پر تھا سکینہ سکینہ صبح و مسا سلاتے تھے مجھے شبیر اپنے داما میں اور اب تو خاک پس ہوتے اور اب تو خاک پس ہوتے اور اب تو خاک پس ہوتے روز یزید نے کہا جنت میں میوے ہے اکثر سکینہ تم کو کھلاتا تھا کیا تمہارا پدر رتب رتب کہا اس بے پدر نے تتلا کر دکھا کے نیل تماچوں کا بولی دے کدھر پدر نے تحفے سے تحفہ رتب کھلائے ہیں اور ان کے بعد تو ہم نے تب اور ان کے بعد تو ہم نے اور ان کے بعد تو ہم चिखाए हैं।
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. First of all, I would like you guys to please keep our today's Tabarruk sponsors in your du'as. And please recite a loud salawat for our salam and marsiya reciters of today. Mir Salman. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. You know, for their Syed and Salamti and every reciter, inshallah. I'm really obliged and honored to have Maulana Bilal here from Dallas. You know, I think Chicago's community is really blessed. We have been getting great scholars and, you know, someone like him who can connect with the youth and be able to deliver the message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and how to maintain azadari and keeping the sanctity of it is the essence of his lectures, inshallah. Quick announcements: there are many majalises that are scheduled starting from tonight. Fawad Bhai's house in Romeoville, then majalises that are many of them scheduled for tomorrow. One is at Zaki Bhai in Bartlett, Ghazanfar Bhai in Schaumburg, and then, you know, later on at Zafar Bhai's the Shab-e-Gham. You know, so Zia Bhai is coming from Atlanta for this for these ayam and these program. He's starting to recite from tonight. Would love to see the entire community, and the Ahl Khana have made a special request for me to extend the invite and requesting all the community members to inshallah join. Another point to be noted that today Maulana Bilal's this is a lecture series of 4 majalises which started from yesterday. So today is going to be the second program, the second majlis. Tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, the 2 more majalises that he has. On Sunday, Zia Bhai is also going to be doing Noha Khani here at IEC as well. Without any further delay, I would now like to request Maulana to please come to the mimbar and recite the majlis. Bawaz-e buland, Nara-e salawat.
اللهم صل على رحم الله من قرأ سورة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على إمام القبلتين ونبي الحرمين وأفضل الثقلين وجد الحسن والحسين الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المنتخبين المظلومين والذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على صاحب الدعوة النبوية والسولة الحيدرية والاسمة الفاطمية والحلم الحسنية والشجاعة الحسينية والعبادة السجادية والمآثر الباقرية والآثار الجعفرية والعلوم الكاذمية والحجج الردوية والجود الثقفية والنقابة النقبية والهيبة العسكرية والغيبة الإلهية. اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه. أما بعد، فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: والشعراء يتبعهم الغاوون ألم تر أنهم في كل واد يهيمون وأنهم يقولون ما لا يفعلون إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وذكروا الله كثيرا وانتصروا من بعد ما ظلموا وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. For the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of Fatima al-Zahra, a second salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time, a louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. One of the most famous incidents in the life of Imam Ali ibn al-Husayn Zainul Abidin alayhi salam is when the Imam, he went towards Hajj at the time that Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, the caliph of that time, was at Hajj. It's stated that Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, he wanted to go and pay his respects to Hajar al-Aswad, the black stone. But every time he tried to go towards the black stone, due to the crowds that were there, he was not able to reach it. So a point it comes that Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, he gives up and he stops trying. He has a throne set up for him on the side, and he is watching the people do tawaf. And as he's watching the people circumambulate the Kaaba, one man, he walks towards the crowd. And the moment he walks to the crowd, the people began to split left and right. And as he walks in between, he reaches Hajar al-Aswad. When Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, he notices this, out of anger, he says, Man hada, who is this? It's stated that the moment he said this, the poet by the name of Al-Farazdak was within the vicinity. And Al-Farazdak at that moment, on the spot, he begins to recite a qasida and an ode. That Hisham ibn Abdul Malik said, Man hada, who is this? Farazdak, he says, هذا الذي تعرف البطحاء وطأته والبيت يعرفه والحل والحرم. That you say, who is this? This is the one that the Kaaba knows who this is. The Haram knows who this is. The land outside of the Haram recognizes the footsteps of this individual. هذا ابن خير عباد الله كلهم هذا التقي النقي الطاهر العلم هذا ابن فاطمة إن كنت جاهله بجده أنبياء الله قد ختموا. That he says that this is the son of the best creation of Allah. This is the one who is pious, who is pure, who is distinguished. This is the son of Fatima al-Zahra, if you're ignorant about this fact. With his grandfather, all of the prophets were sealed. وليس قولك من هذا بضائره الأرب تعرف من أنكرت والعجم. You saying that you do not know who this is does not harm him, because this is that man that the Arabs and the non-Arabs, they know who he is. كلتا يديه غياط أما نفعهما. Both of his hands are like the rain. that they benefit everyone. يُسْتَوْكَفَانِ وَلَا يَأْرُوهُمَا أَدَمُ. Everyone, they rely upon the hands of Zainul Abidin, and never do you see that his hands are empty. In other words, if anyone needs any help, they go towards the doorstep of Imam Zainul Abidin. Sahlul khaliqati la tukhsha bawadiruhu, yazinu hutnan husnul khalqi wa shiyamu. This is the one that his nature is easy, and people do not fear the anger of Zainul Abidin. Because even when he is angry, it is within the bounds of Allah. It is for the justice and the adalat of Allah. And if there are two things which are his zinat and his adornment, then it is that inner nature and it is the character of Zainul Abidin. Hammalu atqali aqwamin idaqtuduhu, khulwu shama'ili tahlu indahu na'amu. This is the one that he carries the burdens of his people. And his nature is something which is sweet. And for him to say yes to others is something which is pleasing towards him. In other words, this is that man, as one scholar would say, that charity in secrecy died when Imam Zainul Abidin died in Medina. That if anyone was in need, it was Imam Zainul Abidin would come to the help of that individual. ما قال لاقت إلا في تشهده لولا التشهد كانت لاءه نأم. That the only time he says no is in tashahud. If there was not that statement, La ilaha illallah, that there is no deity except for Allah, he wouldn't say no to anyone. The only answer that he would give is yes towards everyone. Ammal bariyata bil ahsan. This is the one that he benefits all of the creation of Allah. Fankasha'at anhal ghayahibu wal imlaqu wal adamu. That whenever anyone is in poverty and destitution, whenever anyone has nothing, this is that individual who helps those individuals. إِذَا رَأَتْهُ قُرَيْشٌ قَالَ قَائِلُهَا إِلَى مَكَارِمِ هَذَا يَنْتَهِ الْكَرَمُ. That when the Quraysh, they saw Zainul Abidin, they would say that perfection and makarim have reached this status over here. يُهْدِي هَيَاءً وَيُهْدَى مِنْ مَهَابَتِهِ. This is that individual that out of his humility he lowers his head. But whenever anyone comes in front of them, they lower their head because of the jalal of Zainul Abidin. فَلَا يُقَلَّمُ إِلَّا هِينَ يَبْتَسِمُ. The only time he speaks is when there is a smile upon his face. He is the one that sent, it comes from the hands of Zainul Abidin, and when he approaches the Kaaba recognizes the fragrance of Imam Zainul Abidin. You see, within this ode and these lines of poetry, you find that anyone who listens to such lines of poetry, their hearts are inclined to the fadail and the virtues of Imam Zainul Abidin. You see, I only recited about 13 of the 27 lines that Farazdaki recited. But one of the features of poetry that we find is that what a lecturer accomplishes in 5, 6, 7 lectures, you find Farazdaki accomplished in 27 lines of poetry by bringing the hearts to the fadail of Imam Zainul Abidin. And what this demonstrates is that poetry has a profound role in preserving the legacy of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. You know, this year there was a famous scholar by the name of Syed Munir al-Khabbaz. Syed Munir al-Khabbaz is the most famous speaker within the Arabic language today. And he is the most credentialed speaker within the Arabic language. Usually somebody who is a muhakkik and a researcher, it is not necessary that he is a speaker upon the minbar. But this is one of those rare individuals that both of those qualities, they gather within him. And this year on Shab-e Ashur, he said something very interesting. He said that when you look at the world today, there is no bigger medium to propagate the message of Imam al-Hussein than Noakhani and the poetry for Imam al-Hussein. that bigger than any speaker is the poetry of Imam al-Hussein. More important than any book is the medium of the poetry of Imam al-Hussein. And I'll give you an example. You know, if somebody comes and they deliver a fantastic lecture, maybe less than 1% of the crowd will go and listen to that lecture again. Isn't that the case? Or if I write a book, at most somebody will read it one time. It's a very small of an audience who will read it a second time. But there are certain poems for Ahlul Bayt, there are certain nohas and salams that people, they listen to them every single day. That they are recited throughout marakis and masajid throughout the world. And they have become so embedded in our experience of azah and mourning that if those lines of poetry are not recited, it's as if it is incomplete. You know, for example, if one comes to the shahadat of Imam al-Rida and the khatib does not recite the lines by Bilal al-Khuzai, where Bilal he says, وَقُبُورٌ بِكُوفَانٍ وَأُخْرَى بِطَيْبَةٍ وَأُخْرَى بِفَخٍ نَالَهَا الصَّلَوَاتِ, that there are graves in Kufa and there is a grave in Fakh, and he mentions that all of the graves of Ahlul Bayt are scattered. And then Imam al-Rida says, وَقَبْرٌ بِتُوسٍ يَا لَهَا مِن مُصِيبَةٍ, that O Bilal, there will also be a grave in Tus whose musibah will be great. You see, if this poetry is not recited, for many individuals, the masayib of Imam al-Rida is almost incomplete. Now, I'll give you another example. Most everyone here, their background is from the subcontinent. And the masayib of Sham-e-Ghariba from the subcontinent, you find that experience of that masayib is almost incomplete if they don't listen to that kalam which is called Ghabarayegi Zainab. You see, this kalam, which was written by Dilgir al-Laknavi, who lived in Lucknow in the time of the Nawabs, was an individual who was a Hindu. Then after that, he became a Muslim. And when he became a Muslim, he changed his name to Ghulam Hussain. He said that there is no better name than being the servant of Imam al-Hussein. But you find this kalam for many individuals, it's as if the masayib of Sham-e-Ghariba is incomplete without listening towards this. This goes to demonstrate that poetry has a very profound role in preserving the legacy of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And what I want to do tonight is I want to examine this topic in a number of stages. From the first level, I want to examine that, number one, what is poetry? From the second level, I want to examine that why does the Quran and the Hadith praise and condemn poetry at the same time? From the third level, we'll examine that how did Ahlul Bayt establish poetry as an institution? From the fourth level, we'll examine whom were the famous poets in the lives of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And from the fifth level, we'll examine what lines of poetry were cited on the day of Ashura. Now, when it comes to this discussion, before we come towards the Quran, the Hadith, and the historical examples, it's important that we understand that what is poetry. You see, whenever you look across languages, language is divided into two categories. The first category is nathar and prose. The second category is nadam and poetry. You see, when it comes to prose, the conversations you have with each other are prose. When I am giving this lecture over here, it is prose. When it comes to nathar and prose, there are not any strict rules. That for something to be simple speech, there is no rules that one has to speak in this manner for it to be speech. But when it comes to poetry, there are certain rules for it to be considered shi'r and poetry. If those rules are not abided by, then one does not have the right to call that poetry. The first feature of poetry is that poetry has a wazan and it has a meter. That poetry, you find that there is a rhythm within those lines of poetry. The second feature of poetry is that you find that there is a purpose and a qasd. You cannot just attach random words together and say this is a poem. There needs to be a theme. There needs to be something which is interconnected over there. And the third feature of poetry is that there is a qafiyah, that there is a rhyme at the end of the couplet. You know, for example, when you look at that famous ode of Farazdak which I recited, the qafiyah is the letter mim. هذا الذي تعرف البطاء وطأته والبيت يعرفه والهل والحرم هذا الدخير عباد الله كلهم هذا التقي النقي الطاهر العلم. So in that way you find that each of these lines is ending with the letter mim, and in that way it is a qafiyah. But based on these features, the feature of qasd and purpose, the feature of a meter, and the feature of this rhyme, you find that poetry is able to do something very interesting. You know, when I am having this conversation with you, when we're having this lecture, I am addressing the minds of everyone who is over here, that I am trying to get you to understand the concept. But the nature of poetry is that poetry is not primarily addressing the mind, but poetry is addressing the emotions of an individual. And we know emotions are a powerful factor in motivating action. That's why when you look at politicians and they want you to vote for their political party, they make an appeal towards emotion. And through emotion, they're inciting for you to go and vote for them, because they recognize that emotion has a powerful role within the life of a human being. That is why when you look at poetry, you find that in Arabic, Farsi, and Urdu, it is called shi'r. The word shi'r is related to the word shu'ur. And the word shu'ur means to have an understanding of something which is within you. That's why in Arabic, the verb that they use is sha'artu bil alam. For example, that I felt pain, that I felt happiness. That share is related to that word which is related to feeling and emotion. But there is also another word that share is related to, which is interesting. The word share is also related to the word sha'r, which means hair in Arabic. That the poet, through his lines of poetry, it is as if he is splitting hairs. And through splitting hairs, he is able to invoke emotion in the hearts of his listeners. And I'll give you an example. You know, if I said to you that the body of Imam al-Hussein was on the ground, and the head of Imam al-Hussein is on a spear, I conveyed the situation. The situation was that. But there is one famous poet in Arabic, Salih al-Kawwaz. When he describes this in poetry, he is able to evoke imagery and khayal, which one cannot evoke with regular words. He says about Imam al-Hussein, كأن جسمك موسى مدحوى سائك وكأن رأسك روح الله مدرفيا. You know what he says? He says, O Imam al-Hussein, when that moment it came and your body was on the ground, your body was like Musa, when Musa fell in unconsciousness to the ground. You know, the word used in this poetry is the word sa'ika. There's a verse of the Quran that Musa, he speaks to Allah on the request of his people, and he says to his Lord, Arini andur ilayka, that, oh my Lord, show me yourself so I can look at you. Allah says, قَالَ لَن تَرَانِي, O Musa, you'll never be able to see me. وَلَكِنْ انظُرْ إِلَى الْجَبَلِ فَإِنِ اسْتَقَرَّ مَكَانَهُ فَسَوْفَ تَرَانِي. But O Musa, look at this mountain. Using my own words, Musa, watch this. If this mountain remains in its place, then only then will there be a possibility that you can see me. The verse then it says, فَتَجَلَّ رَبُّهُ لِلْجَبَلِ. Allah did his tajalli and his manifestation upon the mountain. The moment Allah does his tajalli upon the mountain, فَجَعَلَهُ دَقًّا وَخَرَّ مُوسَى سَائِقًا. At that moment, the mountain, it breaks into pieces, and Musa, when he witnesses the tajalli of Allah, he falls on the ground unconscious. This share is saying, O Hussein, your body is like Musa when Musa fell unconscious on the ground. In other words, Imam al-Hussein was absorbed in the tajalli of Allah, in the zat of Allah, in the marifat of Allah. And when he is absorbed in the marifat of Allah, he is willing to give his body away in the path of Allah. You see, I could have simply said the body of the Imam was on the ground. But through this one share, all of this imagery, it comes to the mind of an individual. Then after that, he says, وَكَأَنَّ رَأْسَكَ رُوحُ اللَّهِ مُدْهَوَى رُفِيًا. And your head, O Hussein, was like Isa who was lifted to the heavens. In the way lifting Isa was a mu'jiza and a miracle from Allah, your head, O Aba Abdullah, is a mu'jiza and a miracle. That in Kufa, when all of the women were being looked at, the head of Imam al-Hussein would recite, Am hasibta anna ashab al-kahfi wa raqimi kanu min ayatina ajaba. That do you suppose that the people of the cave and the inscription are astonishing sign? Right now, the head of the Imam is reciting the Quran. So you see, poetry is able to bring khayal and imagination. And that khayal and imagination is able to evoke the emotion of an individual. But now at the second level, we need to examine that does the Quran and the Hadith praise poetry, or does it condemn poetry? You see, the Quran in Surah Al-Shu'ara, in chapter 26, verses 224 to 227, it discusses the issue of poetry. And you'll have to listen to the entire discussion before you bring out your pitchforks and your firewood towards me. But you find that Allah, what does He say? He says, وَالشُّعَرَاءُ يَتَّبِعُهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ. That only the misguided follow the poets. Alam tara annahum fi kulli wadin yahimun. Do you not see that they wander into every single valley? They wander aimlessly. Wa annahum yaquluna ma la yaf'alun, and they say that which they don't act upon. Is this positive or is this negative? The Quran over here is speaking negatively. Another example is we have a hadith from Rasulullah, which is found in Bukhari, and it is ascribed to Imam Sadiq in our traditions, where Rasulullah says, لأن يمتلئ جوف رجل قيها يريه خير من أن يمتلئ شعرا. That the Prophet and Imam Sadiq are ascribed to have said that it is better for the body of an individual to be filled with pus than for it to be filled with poetry. So on one side, this is pretty strong condemnation. But on the other side, we also have traditions that praise poetry. For example, Rasulullah says, Inna fi shi'ri la hikmatan o la hikaman. That within poetry, there's wisdom, for example. Or for example, we find Ahlul Bayt, they say, Man qala fina bayta shi'rin banallahu lahu baytan fil jannah. The one who recites a couplet of poetry for us Ahlul Bayt, Allah builds a house for them in paradise. So on one side, condemnation. On one side, praise. You see, the Quran, it answers this question. After it says, وَالشُّعَرَاءُ يَتَّبِعُهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّهُمْ فِي كُلِّ وَادٍ يَهِيمُونَ وَأَنَّهُمْ يَقُولُونَ مَا لَا يَفْعَلُونَ. That the poets, only the misguided follow them. The poets, they wander into every valley. The poets, they say what they don't act upon. Allah, after that, He gives an exception. He says, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, except those who have believed. وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, and those who act righteously. وَذَكَرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا, and they remember Allah greatly. وَانْتَصَرُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا ظُلِمُوا, and they help those who are madloom and were oppressed. You see, over here in this ayat of the Quran, there are two possibilities. The first possibility is that Allah is condemning all poetry and He is making an exception. The other possibility is that Allah is condemning a specific type of poetry. You see, in the time period of the Arabs, what was poetry? Poetry was boasting about your tribe. It was boasting about your own arrogance. It was about matters which were not virtuous. The Quran is condemning that type of poetry. And you find there were many individuals who carried that tradition onwards. I'll never forget. I was in a cafe, in Dallas, and there was a person who was working. We began to speak in Arabic, and he says to me that you're interested in Arabic literature. And I said, yes, I am. He says, listen to this line of poetry. He began to recite lines which I can't quote from the minbar, but the final line which he says is that فَإِنْ حُرِّمَتْ يَوْمًا عَلَى دِينِ أَحْمَدِ فَخُذْهَا عَلَى دِينِ الْمَسِيحِ ابْنِ مَرْيَمِ. Basically, he's talking about a woman. And he says that if that woman is haram for you on the deen of Rasulullah, then go to the deen of Isa and take her. In other words, your religion doesn't matter, do what you want. So I said to him that who recited these lines of poetry? He said to me, Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And even in the Divan of Yazid, you find that poetry is over there. That this was the style of poetry that Yazid he would recite, وَالشُّعَرَاءُ يَتَّبِعُهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ. When Bibi Zainab, Imam Zainul Abidin, Ahlul Bayt, they entered the court of Yazid, what did Yazid recite? One of the things that he recited was his poetry. He said, لَيْتَ أَشْيَاخِي بِبَدْرٍ شَهِدُوا جَزَعَ الْخَزْرَجِ مِنْ وَكِ الْأَسَلِ. That I wish that my forefathers were here to see this, because on this day I have taken revenge for Badr. I say, was Badr a battle between Banu Hashim and Banu Umayyah? Or was Badr a battle between Islam and Kufr? Yazid's own words of poetry testify that he is saying that I am representing the side who was against the Rasulullah. And if there is anyone who represents the side of Rasulullah, then it is Imam al-Hussein. Because it is only after the shahadat of Imam al-Hussein that revenge for Badr can be taken. So you find this is that type of poetry which would be recited. But the Quran is showing that poetry which has religious value and it promotes the religion. That poetry which promotes moral values. One of the most famous lines of Arabic poetry is that إِذَا الْمَرْءُ لَمْ يَدْنَسْ مِنَ اللُّؤْمِ إِرْدُهُ فَكُلُّ رِدَاءٍ يَرْتَدِيهِ جَمِيلُ. It says that when a man, his character is not dirtied, then every clothing he wears is beautiful on him. In other words, if you're a person of character, then whatever you wear, you'll look good within that. You find this type of poetry is praising moral virtue. It's something which is positive. But the final thing that the Quran shows is that poetry which is in the defense of the madhloom and the oppressed is praised by Allah. And who was a greater madhloom than Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam? You see, when we look at the different sacraments of Azah, the different sha'air of Imam al-Hussein, whether it is Khaq al-Shifa, whether it is the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein, whether it is tawassul to Imam al-Hussein, whether it is poetry, you find that Ahlul Bayt are the ones who would establish this. And in the same way, Ahlul Bayt, they established the institution of poetry for Imam al-Hussein and for Ahlul Bayt in general. But now the question is that how would they do this? And what was the method that they would use to do this? The first way in which Ahlul Bayt would establish poetry as an institution is that they would give a reward to the poets. Farazdak, when he recited his famous qasida for Imam Zainul Abidin, it is stated Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, he places Farazdak in prison in between Makkah and Medina. So Imam Zainul Abidin, he sends 1,000 coins to Farazdak. When Farazdak, he receives those coins, he says, "Oh Imam, I did not recite this poetry for dirhams and dinar, but I recited this poetry out of my love for you." The Imam says, "Oh Farazdak, don't return this money towards us, because we are that household when we give something away, we don't take it back." You find this is an example that the Imam would give a monetary reward to the poets to encourage the poets. Another example, There was a poet who lived in the time period of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhim as-salam. That poet, his name was Qumayt ibn Zayd al-Asadi. It's stated that one day Qumayt ibn Zayd al-Asadi, he comes to Imam al-Baqir and he recites lines of poetry for Imam al-Husain in front of Imam al-Baqir. After he finishes reciting those lines, the Imam says, Ya Qumayt, Lo indana malun la a'tainaka. That if I had wealth, I would give it to you. I don't have anything right now, but if I had it, I would give it to you. وَلَكِنْ لَكَ مَا قَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ لِحَسَّانِ ibn Thabit. But for you, I will say the same thing that Rasulullah said for Hassan ibn Thabit. Hassan ibn Thabit was a poet in the time of Rasulullah who had a very important role. And what was that line which is for Qumayt? He says, La zilta mu'ayyadan biruh al-Quds ma dababta anna ahl al-bayt. That, O Qumayt, as long as you are reciting poetry for us, Ahlul Bayt, Ruh al-Qudus will be supporting you, O Qumayt. You find that poetry at one level is ilham and inspiration. That oftentimes a person thinks that where does this line come from? You find there are traditions that imply that these lines of poetry are a tawfiq and a gift which Allah gives towards that shair. And you find over here Allah is saying that, O Qumayt, as long as your poetry is for us, Ruh al-Qudus is with you, Qumayt. So you find in this manner, monetary wealth, the Imam says, if I had it, I would give it to Qumayt. Another famous example is that when Bilal al-Khuzai, he comes to Imam al-Rida, he recites his famous qasida and martiya. And when he recites that martiya, he says, Madarisu ayatin khalat min tilawatin. ومنزل وحي مكفر الأرسات ديار علي وحمزة وجعفر والسجاد دلتفناتي. He recites a famous marsiya that those houses where the Quran was recited, those houses where wahi would come, the house of Ali and Ja'far and Hamza and Sajjad, all of those houses are empty. After he finishes reciting that, the Imam gives 10,000 coins to Bilal al-Khuzai. 10,000 was not a small amount in that time, and it's not a small amount in this time for the matter, but you find he gives this as a monetary reward to encourage poetry. So the first way in which Ahlul Bayt established poetry as an institution is that they would give a monetary reward to the poets. The second way Ahlul Bayt established poetry as an institution is that they would openly make dua for the poets. You know, one famous poet, as I mentioned, was Qumayt ibn Zayd al-Asadi. Qumayt lives in the time of Imam al-Baqir, the time of Imam al-Sadiq. He meets Imam al-Sadiq in front of the Kaaba, and he recites some poetry for Imam al-Sadiq, and the hadith that says the Imam looks towards the Kaaba, and he says, Allahumma arham Qumayt. Then he turns his face away, looks again, Allahumma arham Qumayt. He turns his face away, a third time he looks to the Kaaba, he says, Allahumma arham Qumayt. That, oh Allah, have mercy on Qumayt. Allah, have mercy on Qumayt. Allah, have mercy on Qumayt. In this way, Ahlul Bayt would openly make dua for the poets to encourage them. In another tradition, Imam as-Sadiq, he says about Qumayt, Allahumma gfir lil Qumayt ma taqaddama min dhanbihi wa ma ta'akhar. That, oh Allah, forgive the past and the future sins of Qumayt. Forgive his open sins and his hidden sins. So the first way Ahlul Bayt encouraged the poets is by giving them monetary reward. The second way is that they would make dua for the poets. The third way Ahlul Bayt would encourage the poets is that they would encourage them to recite. You know, there's one hadith that says, Abu Harun al-Makfuf enters into the house of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. Now the word makfuf means that he was a blind individual. When he comes into the house of Imam Sadiq, you know, there's no bayaz in his hands, there's no book in his hands. He didn't come to recite anything.
the moment he enters the house, without saying to the Imam that I want to recite, the Imam himself encourages Abu Harun by saying, "Oh Abu Harun, anshidni fil Husain," that recite poetry for my grandfather Hussein. Did Abu Harun ask, "Oh Imam, can I recite?" No, he didn't ask. The Imam himself encourages him by saying, "Recite." Abu Harun begins to recite. The Imam looks at Abu Harun and he says, "Don't recite like this. Anshidni kama tunshidun," recite how you normally recite. Abu Harun says, "What do you mean how I normally recite?" He says, "Tartihi kama inda qabr al-Husayn." Recite your marthia as if you are by the grave of Imam al-Hussein. You know, the Imam over here gives an adab and an etiquette to every marthia khan, every noha khan, every soz khan, that when you recite your kalam, the adab is that you recite as if you're by the grave of Sayyid al-Shuhada. So Abu Harun at that moment, he begins to recite the poetry of another sha'ir by the name of Sayyid al-Himyari. And he begins to recite, "Umrur ala jadat al-Husayn, faqul li a'dumih al-zakiyah," that when you go by the grave of Imam al-Hussein, say to the body of Imam al-Hussein that others, they put water on the graves. But I haven't come to put water, my tears will water your grave. And as he's reciting, he sees that Imam al-Sadiq begins to cry. When Imam al-Sadiq begins to cry, he stops his poetry. But then the Imam encourages him a second time. The Imam says, "Zidni bayanan," that, "Oh Abu Harun, why did you stop? Continue to recite." So the Imam told him to recite, and then he says, "Recite more." So in this manner, the Imam is encouraging the poets to recite. You know, it's stated that Kumayt ibn Zayd, he meets Imam al-Sadiq at Hajj. When he meets Imam al-Sadiq, he says, "Oh Imam, ansha'tu sha'ran," that I have come with poetry. The Imam says, "Oh Kumayt, hadih al-ayam ayamu dhikrullah." These are the days of Hajj, they are the days of the remembrance of Allah. These aren't days for poetry. You know what Kumayt says? He says, "Ya Sayyidi, this isn't just any poetry. This is that poetry for you, Ahlul Bayt." So the Imam says, "Oh Kumayt, then recite." In other words, Imam al-Sadiq is demonstrating that our zikr is the extension of the dhikr and the remembrance of Allah. And our poetry is like that poetry which is in the praise of Allah. So the Imam, he encourages Kumayt that he is saying other poetry in these days don't recite. But if that poetry is for us, Ahlul Bayt, then recite that poetry. So the first way is that they would give monetary rewards to the poet. The second way is they would make dua for the poets. The third way is they would encourage the poets to write. The fourth way is something which is even more strange. Sometimes Ahlul Bayt would complete the poetry of the poet. Debil is there, and Debil is reciting وَقُبُورٌ بِكُوفَانٍ وَأُخْرَى بِتَيْبَةٍ وَأُخْرَى بِفَخٍ نَالَهَا الصَّلَوَاتِ. And he is saying there is a grave in Kufa, and there is a grave in Fakh, and all of these graves of Ahlul Bayt have been scattered. Imam al-Rida says, "O Debil, can I give you a line which is tamamu kasidatik? Can I give you a line which will complete your qasida?" And then the Imam says, وَقَبْرٌ بِتُوسٍ يَلَحَا مِن مُصِيبَةٍ. And there will be one grave in Tus whose musibah will be great. How does Imam encourage Debil over here? The Imam encourages Debil by adding to the poetry of Debil al-Khuzai. So you find this is the fourth method. The fifth method is that the Imams would explain the ajr and the reward of reciting poetry. The Imam says, "Man qala fina bayta shairin banallahu lahu baytan fil jannah." The one who recites a line of poetry for us, a couplet, for him is a house in paradise. But then the Imam says something ajib. Some narration will say, "Man qala fina." Other narrations will say, "Man anshada fil Husayn sha'ran." You know what the difference between inshad and to say a line of poetry is? A munshid recites somebody else's poetry. A sha'ir recites his own poetry. You know, some people may say, I don't have the ability to write poetry. It is not within my talent. But the imams are saying over here that that kalam could be someone else's. You didn't work to recite that line of poetry, but this is that house which is so generous that even if you recite the poetry of somebody else and you make somebody cry, falahul jannah, for him is paradise. You know, sometimes people, when they hear these narrations of azab, falahul jannah, they get worried. That how is it that poetry can take somebody towards paradise? You know, they don't remember this when the hadith says that the one who says La ilaha illallah, for him is paradise. If you have an issue over here with these hadith about Imam al-Hussein, then your issue should extend over there as well. The hadith is saying all you have to say is La ilaha illallah, for you is paradise. So you find the standard needs to be the same. So you find that is a side discussion. So in this manner, these 5 ways, or how Ahlul Bayt would establish poetry, they would give a reward to the poets. They would openly make dua for the poets. They would finish the poetry of the poets. They would encourage the poets, and they would tell the ajar of reciting poetry. That's why when you look in the lives of the A'immah, you find that there were several poets who had a great maqam. One of those individuals was Hassan ibn Thabit for a time. Later on, of course, Hassan, he left his loyalty to Imam Ali. But the importance of Hassan ibn Thabit is that the word Mawla, which was taken on the day of Ghadir, one of the proofs that Mawla means Imamat is the poetry of Hassan ibn Thabit. You know, when Allama al-Amini wrote his encyclopedia on the day of Ghadir, several volumes of that encyclopedia were dedicated to collecting poetry on the day of Ghadir. And that poetry was proof to the meaning of the word Mawla. Hassan ibn Thabit, he said in his lines of poetry that Faqum ya Ali, O Ali, stand, for now you are Imaman wa Hadiya. The fact that he uses the word Imam and Hadi goes to show that the meaning of the word Mawla is Imamat, it is Hidayat, it is giving guidance. So you find this is one example. Another famous poet in the times of Ahlul Bayt was Al-Farazdak. Farazdak, he meets Imam al-Hussein and he says to the Imam says to Farazdak, what is the situation in Kufa? Farazdak says, قُلُوبُهُمْ مَعَكْ وَسُيُوفُهُمْ عَلَيْكَ. Their hearts are with you, their swords are against you. And then later Farazdak would recite a qasida for Imam Zainul Abidin and he would be put in prison, he would go through difficulty. This is another example. Another example of a poet in the time of the Imams was Qumayt ibn Zayd al-Asadi. Qumayt, he lives in the time of Imam al-Baqir, Imam al-Sadiq. Another example is Syed al-Himyari, who's in the time of Imam al-Sadiq. You know, Syed al-Himyari wasn't a Syed in the sense that he's from the lineage of Rasulullah, but he was a Syed for the massive status of his works. You know, he is the only poet that when he recited his poetry, Imam al-Sadiq said, stop the Messiah. Every other poet, the Imam said, Zidni bayanan, recite more. But when it came to Syed al-Himyari recited such a line that he said, إِذَا أَتَيْتَ قَبْرَ الْحُسَيْنِ, that when you go to the grave of Hussein, وَابْكِي عَلَيْهِ كَمُؤْذِلَةٍ أَتَتْ يَوْمًا لِوَاحِدِهَا الْمَنِيَةِ. He said that when you go to the grave of Imam al-Hussein, cry like that mother who has one son. And cry like that mother on that day where she lost that one son. The moment he said this, it is stated Imam al-Sadiq said, Sayyid al-Himyari, stop the Messiah. So you find this is another example. Bilal al-Khuzai, in the time of Imam al-Rida, Imam al-Rida gives 10,000 coins to Bilal. You know what Bilal says? Bilal, he says, oh Imam, I don't want these coins, but what I want is I want your shirt. because your shirt will do shafa'ah for me on the day of judgment. This is another example. Another example of a poet in the times of Ahlul Bayt was an individual by the name of Ibn Sakit. Ibn Sakit was a follower and a lover of Imam Ali al-Naqi. And it stated that Ibn Sakit was such a great adib and literature expert and poet that he became the tutor for the children of Mutawakkil. And as he was the tutor for the children of Mutawakkil, one day Mutawakkil says to Ibn Sakit that, are my children greater or Hassan and Hussein? Ibn Sakit says, Jananta, that, oh man, you're Majnoon. You are comparing your children to Hassan and Hussein. Your children are not even greater than the slave of Ali ibn Abi Talib Qambar. You see, this was another poet who was in the time of Ahlul Bayt. You see, there are certain lines of poetry that because they were for Ahlul Bayt, they have become immortalized in history. You know, there are famous lines for Rasulullah that were written that balagh al-ula bi kamalihi, kashafa ad-duja bi jamalihi, hasunat jami'u khisalihi. It says Rasulullah is the one that he reached an elevated status because of his perfection. And wherever there was darkness, it would become nur because of the beauty of Rasulullah. And every quality of Rasulullah was something which was virtuous. You know, the Syed, he says, I wrote these lines of poetry. That night when I went to sleep, Rasulullah came to me and he said, recite your poetry. So I recited the poetry, balagh al-ula bi kamalihi, kashafa ad-duja bi jamalihi, hasunat jami'u khisalihi. Rasulullah says, now complete these lines. I said, what do you mean complete these lines? This is all that I have. Rasulullah says, I will give you the final line. Balagh al-ula bi kamalihi, kashafa ad-duja bi jamalihi, hasunat jami'u khisalihi, wa sallu alayhi wa alihi. He says, if you want this line to be complete, the final thing you do is you send durood upon me and my family. So you find this was one example. Another example of poetry which has been immortalized in history. There was a very famous scholar in Iraq, and this poetry is written in the Haram of Imam Ali. And he shows the power of poetry. He says, Ya barku in ji'ta al-gharifa qullahu, aturaka ta'lam man bi ardika mawdi'u. It says, O lightning, O Bijli, when you come to the land of Najaf, say to the Khaq al-Najaf, do you know who is buried within you? بل فيك ابن إمران الكليم وبعده إيسى يقفيه وأحمد يتبع. Within you Musa is there. Within you Isa is there. Within you Rasulullah is there. بل فيك نور الله جل جلاله. Within you the nur and the light of Allah is there. You see, Isa isn't buried. Musa isn't in Najaf. Rasulullah isn't in Najaf. But he explains what he means when he says, Bal fika wasiyul Mustafa, fika aliyun al-Murtada. The fact that the wujood of Ali ibn Abi Talib is there, it's as if Musa is there. It's as if Isa is there. It's as if Rasulullah is there. It's as if Nur manifests from the Khaq al-Najaf al-Ashraf. You find this individual is immortalized. You know, I gave this example 7 years ago at Husaini. And that example is that all of you know the lines of Mu'inuddin Chishti. Shah Ast Hussain, Badshah Ast Hussain, Deen Ast Hussain, Deen Pana Ast Hussain. And I said that, do you know any other line by Mu'inuddin Chishti? Mu'inuddin Chishti wrote several lines of poetry. It wasn't just one line, but it was that kalam for Imam al-Hussein which made him immortalized. So this demonstrates that it was not Imam al-Hussein was muhtaj and dependent upon the poets, but rather anyone who takes their name, you find their maqam is elevated. You know, as khutaba, as shu'ara, we ourselves don't have any value. If there is any value, then it's because we've taken the name of Ahlul Bayt. But if it was because of our own selves, then people wouldn't even say salam towards us. You find this is how generous that household is. And that's why when you look at the function of poetry, even on the day of Ashura, there were several lines of poetry which were recited in the form of the rajas in the battlefield poetry. You know, there was one companion by the name of Bashir ibn Amr al-Hadrami. Bashir ibn Amr al-Hadrami, it stated that when he is in Karbala, he gains news that his son has been taken captive. So Imam al-Hussein says, Bashir, go and tend to your son. Bashir says that, O Imam al-Hussein, if I leave you, then may the animals of the desert eat my body. In other words, who is my son? Who is the son of Fatima Zahra? You know, Bashir, when he is on the battlefield, he recites the lines of poetry, Al-Yawm ya nafsu ulki ar-Rahman. واليوم تجزين بكل إحسان لا تجزئي فكل شيء فان والصبر أختلق in the Dayan. You know what Bashir says? He says, O soul, on this day you will meet Allah. And O soul, on this day you will be given reward for every hardship. O soul, do not be scared. Everything is fun. Everything will end. If everything is going to end, then sabr is the best thing at this moment. So you find this is expressed in a line of poetry. Another example is the poetry of Hur ibn Yazid al-Riyahi on the day of Ashura. That Hur, he says, Ana al-Hurru wa ma'wa dayfi. That I am Hur, and my quality is that I take care of my guests. Adribu fi a'naqikum bisayfi. And I am the one who will strike your necks with your swords. An khayri man halla bilad al-khayfi. And when I strike you, it is to protect that best individual who has walked upon this earth. And when I strike you, there will be no fear within my heart. You find another example of poetry. After that, you look at Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. He says, Ana Zuhairun wa ana ibn Qayni. Aduduhum bisayfan Husaini. That I am Zuhair, the son of Qayn, and I will use my sword to defend Hussein. Another example. No, another example from the day of Ashura of poetry, because poetry has a function on the day of Ashura, is the poetry of Ali Akbar on the day of Ashura. That as Ali Akbar, he's fighting, he says, Ana Ali ibn al-Husayn ibn Ali. Nahnu wa baytullahi awla bin nabi. Tallahi la yahkumu fina ibn al-da'i. Adribukum bis-sayf o hami an abi. Darba ghulam qarashiyan hashimiyan alawi. That he says that I am Ali, the son of Hussein, the son of Ali. By Allah's house, we are the ones who are closest to God's Nabi. You are that individual. By God, you will not have authority over us. And I will use my sword to defend my father. But when I use my sword, I will not strike you in any manner. I will strike you in the way the one who is from Quraysh strikes. And I will strike you in the way that the one from Banu Hashim strikes. And I will strike you in the way that the one from the nasl and the lineage of Ali ibn Abi Talib strikes. You find this is another example. Another example of poetry on the day of Ashura is when the right arm of Abu Fadl Abbas was cut. That Abu Fadl Abbas, he says, Wallah in qata'tum yamini, inni ohami abadan andini, wa an imamin sadiq al-yaqini, najlin nabiy tahir al-amini. That by Allah, if you cut my right arm, I will continue to defend that truthful Imam. And if you cut my right arm, I will continue to defend the grandson of Rasulullah. Then after that, they cut the left arm of Abu Fadl Abbas. And when they cut the left arm of Abbas, he says, Wallah in qata'tum yasari. That if you cut my right arm, left arm, it doesn't cause me any fear, because ya nafsu la tukhsha, O soul, do not fear, for the mercy of Allah is coming towards you. But no, one other example of poetry on the day of Ashura is when Imam al-Husayn bids farewell to Imam Zainul Abidin. And he says to Imam Zainul Abidin, O Sajjad Shi'ati, go and tell my Shia, Mahma sharibtum adba ma'in fadkuruni, O sama'tum bi gharibin shahidan fandubuni, ana sabtu alladhi min ghayri jurmin qataluni. He says that whenever you drink cold water, remember me. When you hear the news of somebody who is shaheed, remember me. When you hear the news of somebody who is gharib, remember me. But then after that he says, Laytakum fi yawmi ashura jami'an tanduruni. He says that I wish all of you were there on the day of Ashura. Why did the Imam want you to be there? He says, Laytakum fi yawmi ashura jami'an تنظروني كيف أستسقي لطفلي فأبوا أن يرحموني. I wish you saw that moment when I was asking water for my infant, but instead of water, one arrow it went towards Ali Asghar. You see, there's another line of poetry that Imam al-Husayn recited. And that line of poetry was at the grave of Imam al-Hasan. You know, according to certain narrations, the 7th of Safar is the shahadat of Imam al-Hasan. And you know what Imam al-Husayn recited at the grave of his brother? Imam al-Husayn said, Oh my brother Hassan, the lost person is not somebody who has lost mal and wealth. But the person who has lost something is the one who has lost a brother like Hassan al-Mujtaba. That it's stated in Medina, a point it comes where they poison Imam al-Hassan. And as Imam al-Hassan is upon his deathbed, Imam al-Husayn is crying by his brother. And as Imam al-Husayn is crying by his brother, Imam al-Hassan says, Ya Aba Abdullah atabki that, oh Hussein, are you crying over me? Abki alayk, in reality I cry over you. And then he says, La yawmuka ka yawmik ya Hussein, that, oh Hussein, there's no day like yours, oh Hussein. But that moment it comes that Imam al-Hasan begins to vomit his liver. And as he's vomiting his liver into a bowl, he says, oh Hussein, cover that bowl. They say, oh Hassan, why do you want it covered? He says that I don't want Zainab and Kulthum to see. I see, oh Imam al-Hassan, come on the day of Ashura. See if Zainab is standing. Washimar jalisun. Shimmer is sitting on the chest of Hussein. You know, then that moment it comes. Imam al-Hassan leaves this world. They take the janazah of Imam al-Hassan. You know, arrows are fired to the janazah of Imam al-Hassan. One alim would say the difference between the body of Hussein and the body of Hassan is this. Imam al-Hussein, when he was alive, arrow after arrow. Imam al-Hassan, after he passes away, arrows are fired in his. Imam al-Hassan's body was covered in arrows. Imam al-Husayn's body was on top of arrows on the day of Ashura. But as Imam al-Hassan was passing away, he left one wasiyat for his son Qasim. You know, Qasim is the one that Imam al-Husayn says, Kayf al-maut indak, O Qasim. You know, there are many things about the shahadat of Qasim that Imam al-Husayn doesn't do anywhere else. The first thing is everyone is shaheed. But Imam al-Hussein only asks Qasim, how do you find that? The second thing is that on the day of Ashura, Qasim is waiting. And the mother of Qasim says, go and give this khat towards your uncle. You know, Imam al-Hussein does something over there. Syed ibn Tawus says that when Imam al-Hussein sees that letter of his brother, he hugs Qasim. And when he hugs Qasim, Bakaya hatta ghashiya alayhima. Both of them cry so much that they fall unconscious upon the ground. After that, Hamid ibn Muslim says, فَخَرَجَ إِلَيْنَا غُلَامًا كَأَنَّهُ شِقَّةُ الْقَمَرِ. That Qasim comes out of the tent. And as I'm watching this young man, the armor doesn't fit on the body of Qasim. And as Qasim is about to get upon his horse, Hussein comes out of the tent and he places the sandal on the foot of Qasim. Qasim gets on the horse. Qasim begins to fight. You know, as Qasim is fighting, one Maloon strikes the head of Qasim. But Qasim doesn't fall on the ground. The foot of Qasim gets caught upon the horse. The horse is moving. The body of Qasim is being dragged on the ground. You know, one alim would say that why is it that Imam al-Hussein only asked Qasim kayf al-maut indak? And you know what answer he gives? He says every other shaheed, after they passed away, their body was trampled. Qasim is that one shaheed that when Qasim was alive, the body of Qasim was being broken to pieces. Imam al-Hussein goes to Qasim. You know, when the Imam would go to each of the shuhada, the Imam would say a line. At the body of the Abbas, the Imam said, Alan inkasara dhari. That Abbas, my back is broken. At the body of Ali Akbar, he said, Ala dunya badak al-afa. That may this world become khak after you, Ali Akbar. But you know what the Imam says at the body of Qasim? The Imam says, oh Qasim, what will I tell your mother that you were calling your uncle? Your uncle wasn't able to help you. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. ماطم يا حسين يا حسين.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein,
یا حسین یا حسین بسم اللہ یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین ہو سلام اس پر کے جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی پاؤں میں ہے آبلے اور آبلوں میں خار بھی ہو سلام اس پر کے جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی ہو سلام اس پر کے جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی ہو سلام ہے ہو سلام اس پر کے جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی پاؤں میں ہے آبلے اور آبلوں میں خار بھی ہو سلام اس پر کے جو ہے ہو سلام اس پر کے جو آنکھ میں آنسو اور زخم جگر میں ہونٹوں پہ ردا کا نوحہ کرب بلا سے ہے شام تلک وہ کانٹوں پہ سفر کرتا تھا بے ردا سیدانیاں اس پر ستم بازار بھی ہو سلام اس پر کے جو ہے ہو سلام نو کس نا پر ہے باپ کا سر ہے اس بات سے دل بے قابو بے چادر ہے ناموس پیمبر ماحول شرابی ہر سو خون رو اے ساربا اور سید ابرار بھی ہو سلام اس پر کے جو ہے ہو سلام اس پر کے جو دیکھنے والی آنکھوں نے دیکھا اس راہ میں یہ بھی منظر ایک مسافر پابند سفر ہے خود اپنی لاش اٹھا کر یہ امام وقت ہے اور قافلہ سالار بھی ہو سلام اس پر کے جو ہے ہو سلام اس پر کے جو خون رگوں کا یا غیرت ہوش کہتی ہے جھکا لے سر کو توق و سلاسل کیا قید کریں گے ہائے صبر کے اس پیکر کو سر اٹھا کس طرح ہے راہ میں بازار بھی ہو سلام اس پر کے جو ہے ہو سلام دیکھ کے زینب سجاد کی حالت فریاد یہی کرتی تھی میرا یقین ہے ایمان ہے میرا ہے شام کے بے کس قیدی روئیں گے تجھ پر صدا مسند بھی اور دستار بھی ہو سلام اس پر کے جو ہے ہو سلام. بیٹھا کہیں پر جب تک کہ مسافر 40 شبوں کا جاگا. نیند جو آئی بے کس قیدی کو دروں سے جگایا جاتا دیکھ کر رویا فلک اور زینب لاچار بھی. ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو ہے ہو سلام. ناحق نہ ہے عرفان اور مظہر تاریخ مقاتل سب ہی آل پیمبر اور شام کی گلیاں. شبیر کا بیٹا قیدی کیوں نہ ہو محو فغا کرتاس بھی اشعار بھی. ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو ہے ہو سلام. پاؤں میں ہے آبلے اور آبلوں میں خار بھی. ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو ہے ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو یا حسین.
اللهم صل.
السلام عليك يا رسول الله خاتم النبيين. السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين ووصي رسول رب العالمين. السلام عليك يا فاطمة سيدة النساء العالمين. السلام عليك يا حسن بن علي المجتبى ناصح الأمين. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليكم يا قصة المعصومين من ذرية الحسين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء. السلام عليك يا معين الضعفاء والفقراء. السلام عليك يا شمس الشموس أنيس النفوس أيها المدفون بأرض تونس. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولاي يا صاحب الزمان. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن وكعبة الإيمان. عجل الله تعالى فرجه وسعد الله تعالى مخرجه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.